I am so conservative,
Rationalized in my head. These are things I read in
and
the
I'm going to talk
scripture.
about Willow Creek.
Okay.
Willow Creek, a few years back, had
Remembered
invited.
at the time when Will Rogers said, I don't belong to any organized religion. I'm a Baptist.
Yeah.
I am so conservative. If you didn't jump to conclusions, you might not get any exercise. I am so conservative. I am so conservative. And welcome to the Unknown Webcast. Today is September 21, 2021, and this is broadcast number 258. For those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones, this is just a bit of a trigger warning. I really am so conservative, I can't turn left even when I'm driving. In addition to giving trigger warnings, we also try to alert our viewers, try to protect our viewers by drinking coffee. Both Ron Hensel and I
Yep,
both drink coffee for your protection.
for yours.
Yes, and mine too. In January 2006, Al Gore asserted the world would reach a point of no return in 10 years unless we took drastic measures to reduce greenhouse gases. It is currently claimed there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today than at any point in time in the last 800,000 years. Today, Dr. E. Calvin Beisner is joining us to share some thoughts on the current status of global warming. My name is Don Vino, and I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast, and our senior researcher is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie Baby.
So, Don, when you need to roll over in bed, you just keep on rolling over to the right until
I
you
do. I
fall out,
absolutely.
and then you
Yep.
got to get up and go to the other side. And okay, it's got to be hard to be you, when you're.
It is not. It is. I had to ride with someone not too long ago. They were driving and they went to make a right turn, so a left turn. So I had to turn. I had to look to the right to make sure I was.
Yes, greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm trees came out and saw their shadows. And now we have 12 more months of summer. And speaking of palm trees, our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is Carbona Grande Resorts and Spas, the investment opportunity of the new climate world order. Our regular legal disclaimer, our guest on today's webcast, insert name here, E. Calvin Beisner, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast, hereafter known as the webcast, although we probably will not mention it again. This satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall under the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content. This straight from the desk of our law firm, Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Our regular bulletin board announcements. Notice the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too. If you enjoy it, or if it really annoys you and you want to inflict it on someone else to ensure your continued access, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. Greetings, Dr. Beisner. How are you?
Greetings. Well, I'm doing all right. How are you?
Hey.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we're glad to have you. So now you're in the land of R&B, the blues. What was that song?
He's in
Walking Through Memphis.
in Tennessee. Yeah, we don't want to give too many tip-offs where he might be. But
No.
Yeah, there are too many people out after my scalp. I'd rather not give a close indication of where we are.
Did you put on your blue suede shoes and board the plane?
So,
Okay.
so climate change. Al Gore, I remember, by the way, you are president of Cornwall Alliance,
For the stewardship of creation, yes.
Right.
Which means you're trying to destroy the planet, obviously.
Right.
Yeah, that's, obviously that's what we think would be the most honoring to God and the most loving to our neighbor, would be to destroy the planet.
That's the narrative, at least.
Well, that is a narrative from the other side. You are one of the evil cabal trying to destroy the planet and kill off all humanity.
And you couldn't afford a Death Star, so you decided to do it with fossil fuels.
With pollution. Yeah, exactly. Fossil fuels. It's interesting. Just as a side note, Michael Moore did a really interesting documentary, The Planet of the Humans, in search of all of the wonderful ways that they are developing green energy to rescue the planet from destruction. And what he discovered in all of that is they haven't actually improved the planet. They actually are adding more pollution and pollutants to the planet with this. Yeah. And his personal view is really what we have to do is reduce Earth's population. That's kind of his conclusion.
Yeah, Moore, it's a rare thing that I agree with Michael Moore about anything.
Right.
But Moore was right on when he pointed out that the various different so-called renewable energy systems, I don't call them renewables, I call them unreliables, wind and solar in particular, they actually have a worse impact on the environment than fossil fuels. Now, Moore is totally convinced that fossil fuels are killing the entire planet. Right. So, hey, if you've got a worse impact from the substitute for fossil fuels than you have from the fossil fuels, and the fossil fuels are killing the planet, well, then you better get rid of everything that we use for energy. But the only way to do that is to reduce the total number of us, because frankly, energy is absolutely indispensable to human life.
We should just go back to burning.
We would just be better off with a whole lot fewer of us.
I guess the alternative would be burning trees, and with about 7 billion people on the planet, that doesn't sound like a really good long-term solution, especially when you consider how much carbon it would release back into the atmosphere.
Yeah, for sure, if you believe the notion that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is causing dangerous to catastrophic global warming. Now, if you think instead that it's causing a little bitty bit of global warming, but it's not dangerous, it's actually primarily beneficial, and that the CO2 meantime is also fertilizing all the plants on the earth, making more food available for everything that eats plants, or eats something else that does eat plants, well, then you're not so uptight.
Isn't that heresy? I mean, can't you be burned at the proverbial stake for that?
Well,
that would be even more carbon right there. I mean,
no. They would not burn us at the stake, because then they'd have to burn something that would put some more CO2 in the atmosphere.
Right. That's a problem.
Instead, what they'll do is they'll take us to the nearest beach and tie us right at the high tide mark, and then let us stay there until sea level rises enough to drown us.
But don't decomposing bodies also release greenhouse gases? I mean, come on, you can't win.
That's true. Yeah.
So let's back up a little bit, because in my misbegotten and misspent youth, there was the big claim that we're going to have a glacial age again, and this glacier is going to come all the way down nearly to Florida. So anyone living in the Chicagoland area is either going to have to move or freeze to death, because the ice will be so thick here. Suddenly Florida became more desirable if you wanted to continue living. And then the script got flipped as we got the script. Yeah, they flipped the script to say, oh, no, we were wrong. It's not global cooling that's the problem. It's global warming that's the problem. Yeah. And that didn't seem to be working out so well, although it did generate new businesses that were benefiting in the government largesse in the process. So now it's just climate change.
We do have to recognize that this was good science. This was science in action. You see, the science, the settled science, from the 1950s, 1960s, right into the mid-1970s, was telling us loud and clear we're headed for another ice age and we need to do something to stop this global cooling. In fact, it actually had some people recommending that we should build a whole lot more nuclear power plants, place them all around the edges of the oceans, so that their cooling, their use of cooling water would warm the oceans in order to prevent the global cooling that was going on. But then what happened was that global average temperature pretty obviously began to rise from the mid-1970s. And so, like good scientists, they said, okay, no, the problem isn't global cooling, it's global warming. The interesting thing is they blamed our industrial activity, and particularly our use of carbon-based fuels, hydrocarbon fuels, oil, gas, and coal, for the cooling, and then they blamed them for the warming. And, you know, that's where the science starts to get a little bit...
It seems to be that no matter what fossil fuels do, they're destroying the planet, one way or the other.
Yeah.
Now, Don, when you were having your misspent youth, I mean, Tom Lehrer was singing, "If you visit American City, you will find it very pretty. Just two things you must beware: don't breathe the water and don't drink the air." So, you know, I mean, we had pollution. Well, you know, and we had. I keep telling people, when I was like, I tell young people, if you're in your teens or early 20s, I said, when I was your age, I was told that in 20 years I was going to be dead. By the year 2000, I would not only be dead, I'd be dead like 4 or 5 times over. Air pollution, water pollution, nuclear war, biological war, the hole in the ozone, the cutting down of the rainforest, all these things. They're going to take away my oxygen. And so I come to the 90s, and I have to admit, I was a little concerned when I was buying real estate in Florida, and I was being told that within just a few years it would all be underwater. Later, I found out that the underwater referred to the mortgage because of the. That's the only one. But so it's like I was trying to give the science a chance, but I feel like I've been taken to the cleaners like several times in my life. It seems like there is a predisposition in a certain part of society towards doomsday scenarios.
Yes.
So there sure is. And, you know, you happen to mention just now the notion of pollution and it's killing everybody and all this. I just have finished writing a new blog post for Cornwall Alliance's blog. And I noticed here on our screen that I'm able to share my screen. If you may I do that for a moment?
We'd like you to.
I'll show you a great graph from here. Let's see, share screen, and we are going to say, let's see, just share it. Okay, so here we go. Can you see this graph now?
No, it's not being shared.
Do you got to make it full screen probably, and then hit the share button? But I can. I'm going to your website as we speak, and is it in the? There
we go. There we go. How about?
There we go. Yeah.
There. Yeah.
What is that?
This is a graph from Statista.com.
Okay.
The number of deaths attributable to air pollution in the United States from 1900 to 2019. And what you see in here is that number of deaths has been falling rapidly just since 1990. Now, in fact, one could go back farther. Statista.com unfortunately doesn't do this, but back in the 1980s, when I wrote my book, Prospects for Growth, a biblical view of population resources in the future, I gave air pollution statistics showing that air pollution levels in the United States had been falling since the 1960s. And for most of the major air pollutants, they had fallen anywhere between about 50 and 99% from the 1960s to the early 1980s. Well, if they had fallen that much then, and now deaths from air pollution have fallen by 90-some% from 1990 to 2019, air pollution must really be a very, very minor problem in the United States. The problem is people don't look back at history. And as you guys know, the philosopher George Santayana said, those who refuse to remember history are condemned to repeat it.
Right.
So,
usually in their senior year.
The stats just don't support the notion of, the end of the world coming because of air pollution. What we see in every situation is that as a society goes from subsistence agriculture to early industrialization, pollution rises, but so does the production of food and clothing and shelter and safe transportation and medical care and so on, much, much faster than pollution does, which is why life expectancy rises much more rapidly than does pollution. But then, as a society reaches a particular economic level, and this level differs from pollutant to pollutant, that pollution emission rate will peak, and then it'll fall off. And after a fairly short time, the society's environment will be cleaner than it was before the industrialization.
Can you expand that graph so we can see the years when it really started declining? If you hit the control key with the plus, we might be able to see a little better. So that's happening, and it really starts to decline in the
year 2000.
Oh, okay, air pollution. Okay, so
number of deaths. No, this is
number of deaths.
Number of deaths per 100,000 in the population.
Oh, and it's the U.S.
attributable to air pollution in the U.S. from 90 to 2019.
Wouldn't a liberal person be tempted to say that's from the Clean Air Act? That's a result of enforcing standards?
Well, if that were the case, then the Clean Air Act took a long time to start having any effect. The Clean Air Act was adopted in the early 1970s.
Right.
So it's been around for about 30 years. Now, this is, I would think, and I'd have to take some time to really examine the longer term statistics. This Statista.com graph happens to go back only to 90. I think that this is partly a sort of a statistical artifact, but I really can't say on that right now. What we do see is an enormous drop, and then perhaps a little bit of a rise, 2017, 18, 19. But this is deaths per million inhabitants. No, I'm sorry. No, it is absolute number of deaths, which means, for example, that this is deaths per, by 2019, roughly 330 million. 60,000 some deaths per 330 million people. Now, also, by the way, there's a good reason to take this with a whole boatload of salt, because there's only one way you know for sure that somebody died of air pollution.
Yeah, really.
Namely, he locks himself in the garage and starts his internal combustion engine automobile and kills himself with carbon monoxide. Other than that, I mean, out in the real world,
sticking your head in a chimney here could do the same thing. Keeping it there for days.
But in the real world, where we all live all the time, the only way to try to figure out how many people die from air pollution is to compare death rates in more and less badly polluted areas, and
like
then
Beijing.
Extrapolate from those comparisons how many of those extra people who died in location B versus location A were killed because of the added air pollution in location B. The problem with that is that there are all kinds of different contributors to deaths, and you'd have to rule out all the others. That's a rather difficult thing to do. And then besides that, there are things that contribute to air pollution that also contribute to lower life expectancy, higher mortality rates per year. So even these numbers in front of us here from Statistica.com, or Statista, rather, I would take with a major grain of salt, because I think it's extremely difficult to identify what people actually died of air pollution.
Yeah.
As one example of the problem with that, and I'll go ahead and stop sharing the screen now if I can. Yeah. An example of the problem with that is that the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency says that ultrafine particle pollution, what's called PM 2.5, particulate matter 2.5. That's a piece of it is less than 2.5 microns in size. That's a tiny, tiny fraction of the thickness of a human hair, right?
Whoa.
The EPA says that PM 2.5 is a deadly air pollutant. The problem is that no empirical studies have ever been able to verify that, and in fact, the EPA itself ran a bunch of experiments trying to test for the toxicity of PM 2.5. It actually put people in sealed containers and pumped diesel exhaust into them because
real
people. Real people, yeah. Pumped diesel exhaust into these containers to see what happened. And guess what?
What could go wrong?
Nobody got badly hurt except one woman in the testing, one woman who had a terrible, terrible heart condition beforehand, and her heart condition acted up. Now, was that because she was in this gas chamber, so to speak? Nobody knows. But the fact is, EPA's own tests failed to demonstrate that PM 2.5 had any fatality effects. But here's the really fun thing. If EPA really believed that PM 2.5 was a deadly poison, and that, as Lisa Jackson, then the EPA administrator, had put it, there is no safe level. Even a tiny bit can kill you. If they really believed that, then running those experiments meant they were violating the Nuremberg laws that came out of the Nuremberg trials in Germany that specify you cannot run medical experiments on people without their informed consent. And nobody was informed by the EPA.
Yeah, well, not that we would ever do something like that or have ever done anything like that before.
No, just forget about Tuskegee.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah.
It also
forget about what we're doing right now with vaccines.
It also seems to me there was a judge not that many years ago that had ruled that carbon dioxide is a hazardous, poisonous gas, and we need to eliminate it.
Well,
yeah, that wasn't one particular judge, and they didn't put it quite that way. It was the Supreme Court in the case Massachusetts versus EPA back in 2007. And there's this fascinating section of the majority opinion in Mass v. EPA, where they say that they define an air pollutant as any substance that can be suspended in the air.
such as oxygen.
Such as birds. Birds.
Oh, bugs. Yeah, I'm always afraid I'm going to inhale some birds. I think. Yeah, they're definitely a threat to air travel sometimes.
Yeah.
You got to wonder about. Somebody once said 84.9% of statistics are made up on the spot, and the other 40% are just wrong. It's like, and of course, we all know what Mark Twain said: "White lies, he's lies, something lies, and statistics."
Lies, damn lies, and statistics.
Yeah, right. Sometimes it's just the way they use them. Sometimes it's the statistics themselves, as you're pointing out. How do you know? How do you even come up with a statistic for deaths from air pollution? I don't even trust the government when it tells me how many people died from COVID, given the parameters they set, the criteria they allegedly established. Basically, if you died within 100 yards of a COVID virus, you died of COVID. So.
Yeah, forget about the crushed skull from your motorcycle accident.
Right, right.
Yeah. Now, let's not be overly skeptical here. There is some sense to collecting data based on observations. Unfortunately, when it comes to the climate change issue, an awful lot of people have begun to confuse climate models with evidence.
Right.
Now, evidence is what we get either in the laboratory or out in the real world, when we make measurements of physical objects. That's empirical evidence, right? Climate models are not evidence. Climate models are very, very sophisticated guesses as to how the climate will respond if we change this or that input to it, right? So that means climate models are guesses. Now, I love to refer to the Nobel Prize winning physicist Richard Feynman in a little video clip of his from way back in the early 1960s. I think it was done at Cornell University. He's explaining, how do we identify a law in science, a law of nature? And he said, here's how we do it. First, we guess. And kind of laughed, and he said, "Don't laugh. I mean, this is real. This is the way we do it. We guess, then we make predictions of what we ought to find out in the real world if our guess is true. Then we go out in the real world and we look, and we see if our observations contradict our guess, our predictions rather. If the observations contradict the prediction, then the guess is wrong. And it doesn't matter how smart you are, or how beautiful your guess is, or what your name is, he could have added, or how many people agree with you. If the observations contradict the predictions, the guess on which the predictions were made is wrong, period. Now, the computer models of our global climate have been consistently wrong, and fascinatingly enough, getting wronger over time.
wronger and wronger.
Yeah, wronger and wronger. They've been consistently wrong, and there are a variety of different reasons why. I mean, first of all, they're extremely complex. We're talking millions and millions of lines of code that we take the world's fastest computers to run. It's an extremely expensive business. We spend billions of dollars on this every year. We ought to be getting a good payoff, but we're not. But there are various reasons. One of the reasons ties right into what you started us off with on the program today by reference to the notion from an article in tomorrow.io, the weather blog there, the global warming status. They said there's no doubt about the fact that global warming is critical. They said, how do we know this? Their answer, there's more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today than at any point in time in the last 800,000 years.
Really?
All right. Well, that sounds a little alarming, but let's try to give it a little bit of significance. The fact is that prior to the Industrial Revolution, carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere had fallen to around 270 parts per million. Now, at about 180 parts per million, photosynthesis stops, which means all plant life ceases.
Say that number again?
180 parts per million, okay. Photosynthesis stops. Stops at a little bit higher, a little bit lower.
That's a bad thing, right?
That's a very bad thing, because when photosynthesis stops, all plants die, and therefore everything that depends on plants dies too. So there would be no life on Earth. We were getting dangerously close to that. Through the vast majority of Earth's history, if you embrace old Earth geology, and the vast majority of people who are climate scientists do, so it's okay for us to say, all right, if you think this, then you need to think that too, right?
Right. You've got to stay consistent with your view.
Yeah. Consistent with your view, you think that through the vast majority of Earth's roughly 5 billion years, and indeed through the vast majority of time since life came onto Earth, and even through the vast majority of time since mammal life came on Earth, and even through the vast majority of time since human life came on Earth, carbon dioxide concentration was more in the range of 2,000 to 4,000 parts per million. It had been falling drastically in more recent times and almost got to where photosynthesis stops and plant life dies, and therefore everything else dies. Instead, with the Industrial Revolution, we began taking out of the earth carbon dioxide that had been planted there as forests died and were covered up with sediments and things. Let's not mention the fact that the only way for that to happen so quickly that you should get fossils is massive, massive flooding with immense amounts of mud covering the forests very, very quickly. It doesn't happen through slow processes like the old Earth geologists insist are the only ones. But anyway, all of this carbon dioxide from the earlier atmosphere had been taken in by the various plant life. Then a bunch of that got covered up, kept down inside the earth. We're digging it up, we're pumping it out, and we're burning it, and we're returning this carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which means we're getting CO2 levels up to higher levels, which are very, very, very good for plants. Because with every doubling of CO2 concentration in the atmosphere, you get an average 35% increase in plant growth efficiency. And that's just good for everything that depends on plants, which means all of life on Earth. But now, carbon dioxide is indeed a so-called greenhouse gas. Now, greenhouse is not a proper analogy for it because it doesn't work that way, but we can live with it. Carbon dioxide is what's called an infrared absorbing gas. Infrared is, we can also call it heat. When energy comes from the sun and strikes the surface of the earth, most of it bounces back out towards space. If that weren't the case, the earth would get hotter and hotter and hotter, and soon we'd be in blazes just like the sun, and no, there'd be nobody living here.
Like Venus.
But if all of it bounced back out to space, the earth would be frozen completely, and there would be no life here. Instead, the atmosphere contains a variety of different chemicals. By the way, chemicals are not bad things. Everything in the universe is made of them. But some people in the environmental movement,
including us,
everything is called a chemical. The atmosphere contains chemicals that absorb infrared, and then they radiate it back out so that some of it comes back down toward the surface of the earth. As a result, we have a livable temperature in the earth. Carbon dioxide is one of those. And you would think that as you add more carbon dioxide, you're going to warm the surface of the earth. And to a limit, that's true. The trouble with that, though, is that carbon dioxide's warming effect is what's called logarithmic. It's large for the first increment of CO2 that you add. It's smaller for the next increment. It's smaller than that for the next increment, and so on. Now, essentially, CO2's warming effect is pretty much all used up by the time you get to about 300 parts per million, maybe 350.
Really?
Now, today, we're at about 410 parts per million, almost 420, actually.
So you're saying that the difference between 350 and 410 is negligible?
I wouldn't quite call it negligible. It's still, calculable.
Okay.
But it is not huge. And when we go from the current 410 or 420 to the next doubling up to, say, 820 or 840, the warming from that will be no more than the warming that we got from going from pre-industrial 280 parts per million to 560 parts per million would be a doubling from that. The reason for this is that CO2, like every other infrared absorbing gas, absorbs infrared only within certain parts of the spectrum. And it's pretty well absorbed all the infrared in those parts of the spectrum already. It's kind of like if you have a window on your house, right? And you want to block out the sunlight coming from that window permanently. You don't just want to have curtains. So you paint white paint over your window, right, over the glass. Now that white paint, that first layer of white paint will block almost all the light, but not quite all. So maybe you put a second coat of white paint on it, and that will block almost all of the remaining light, but not quite all. So you put a third coat on. That will block almost all of the remaining light, but you know what? At this point, the remaining light is so slight that it doesn't make any difference. You don't care anymore. So you don't add another coat. Well, CO2 has already reached the point where it has absorbed pretty much all the infrared that it possibly could absorb, and we could double, triple, quadruple CO2 in the atmosphere and not cause dangerous global warming.
So are you saying it doesn't absorb the entire bandwidth of infrared or the heat causing portion, only a portion of, okay.
Right. Each IR gas, each infrared absorbing gas absorbs only within certain bands of the spectrum.
Okay.
And it's a variety of different bands. Each one absorbs in multiple bands in different parts of the spectrum, but not in all bands. CO2's bands are
now there are those, by the way, we need to interrupt because we need to take just a really short break because there are those who are really concerned about global warming. But we have a sponsor that is going to help you take advantage of that.
Put your mind at ease. Like when you see images like this, what do you think of? Vacation fun, relaxation, time away with the family. Well, here are two words you should be thinking. Cha-ching. Because any day now, the Arctic beaches of Canada, Alaska, Greenland, and Northern Europe will all look like this, making them the investment opportunity of a lifetime. Work will soon be starting on our new chain of Carbona Grande resorts and spas. All you need to do is contact Oxgore Industries today for a free investment perspective at 1-800-CLIMATE. So, when the rest of the world looks like this, you can look like this through your investment at Carbona Grande Resorts and Spas, the investment opportunity of the new climate world order, the new Green Deal. It's coming your way. So this is really important because, I mean, what we've heard, and this seems to be obviously from people who have no idea what they're talking about, is that if carbon dioxide levels keep going up and up and up and up, we will become like planet Venus. The surface temperature is hot enough on Venus to melt lead. But one thing that I have pointed out to people who say this is that Venus actually creates more heat from its volcanic surface than it absorbs from the sun. It's got such a thick cloud layer; it's not able to even take in as much energy as the sun as reaches Venus. It reflects more back into space than it does absorb it. So Venus is not really a fair comparison, and we will never have 96% of our atmosphere is carbon dioxide. That's just not going to happen.
There isn't enough carbon in the Earth to put our CO2 up to that level. We could burn all of the theoretically known fossil fuels in the crust of the Earth and wouldn't be able to get CO2 concentration above about 8,000 parts per million. That's 8/10,000ths of 1%, right?
And yet the Venus trope is very common online, and I've never heard a single climate scientist debunk it. Maybe they're out there. I've just never seen them even bother.
The so-called climate skeptics, global warming skeptics, right? They debunk it all the time. But the scientists on the other side, they don't want to debunk that.
No, they don't.
Although they know it's false, they know it's wrong, they don't want to debunk it because doing that weakens their position and interferes with their agenda.
It weakens the panic level. They have a direct investment in keeping that panic level high, as opposed to keeping the information level high.
Yeah.
Okay. So, let's ask another question here. Deforestation, mass deforestation has taken place, is the claim, and you referenced the website we have gotten some of their claims from, which has left our planet with fewer trees and less oxygen production. Global warming is critical as climate change is leaving our planet with less oxygen and more carbon dioxide.
Yeah, that's that's another myth. First off, plankton in the seas make a whole lot more oxygen than all the world's forests combined.
Yep.
And in fact, the notion, we heard a few years ago that the Amazon rainforest is the lungs of the earth, right? Well, that was completely debunked. That contribution to CO2 in the atmosphere, or pardon me, to oxygen in the atmosphere, is minuscule compared with that of plankton in the oceans. So that's the first problem with that. The second problem with this is that factually, although considerable deforestation is happening in certain locations, around the earth as a whole, the total amount of forested area has actually been growing over the last roughly a century, including the last 40 or 50 years, the period during which supposedly human-induced global warming has been happening. And so you've got an effect from a cause that didn't happen, right? And then there's a third real problem with this, and that is that the very people who are bellyaching about deforestation here are also the people who are so uptight about our using fossil fuels. And so instead, they want us to substitute, for example, palm oil. Well, wiping out rainforests in Indonesia and South America to replace them with palm forests to get palm oil to burn, which results in slightly lower CO2 emissions than gasoline and diesel from petroleum. This is the biggest driver of deforestation in the world. Second biggest driver of deforestation is probably the increasing use of wood pellets as a substitute for coal in electric generating plants. And why are we doing that? Well, because we want to get away from coal in order to prevent global warming. So the folks who are uptight about global warming are prescribing medication that hurts the disease.
Well,
Makes the
okay.
disease worse.
More intense heat waves that last for more extended periods, accelerated sea levels rising, as well as the loss of sea ice.
Here's another instance.
I'd like to add one other thing. One other thing is, quote, a dramatic increase in hurricanes. We just heard our president talking about the increase in devastation of hurricanes.
Another instance of people citing model output as if it were empirical evidence. It's not. Now, some of the global climate models indicate that with global warming, you might have an increase, a very, very tiny increase, by the way, so small as probably not to be measurable, not to be identifiable with any given storm. But nonetheless, some of the models say that with an increase in global average temperature, you'll have an increase in the strength and maybe even the frequency of hurricanes, of heat waves, of droughts, of wildfires, things of this sort. Now, that's model prediction. Real world observation is where real science comes in. And real world observation tells us there has been zero increase in the frequency or the intensity of any extreme weather events. Hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts, heat waves, cold snaps, wildfires, anything. There's been no increase in the frequency or the intensity of any of those. And in fact, there has been some decline in the frequency and the intensity of major hurricanes since the mid-1970s, the period during which supposedly man-made warming has been occurring most recently. And there's actually an interesting explanation for that I came up with myself, really. Neil Frank, director of the National Hurricane Center. You see, global warming driven by greenhouse gases all of the different theories about this agree that it happens primarily toward the poles, not the equator, primarily in winter, not in summer, and primarily at night, not in the daytime, which means that are the cold ones. The high temperatures are not. And you're getting a reduction in the temperature difference between the equator and the poles. Well, hurricanes happen as a part of the mechanics, the engineering, so to speak, of the entire climate system. The role of hurricanes is to move heat from the equator to the poles. If you have less difference in temperature between equator and poles, there's less need for that. And therefore, you should have fewer and weaker hurricanes rather than more and stronger hurricanes with global warming. So I actually said that once in a radio guest appearance, and a variety of people got very upset at me and just ridiculed me and said, "You're no climate scientist. What do you have? What do you have to do saying something like that?" And then I got a phone call at my office, and the voice on the other end of the line said, "You don't know me, but my name is Dr. Neil Frank, and I was the longest-serving director of the National Hurricane Center." And I thought, "Oh boy, I blew it now. He's about to read me out." And he said, "I just called to tell you, stick with your guns. You are absolutely right."
Wow. And this is the thing. Most people don't know the difference between trusting the science and trusting the scientists.
Yes, absolutely.
They don't get that. Now, if you've ever been to a scholarly conference, that is, and I don't go to climate conferences, but I've been to theological conferences, and I've got a lot of friends. I don't go to as many as my friends do, through Society of Biblical Literature and other places. But what you learn very quickly, just by attending them, is that people are they're very ego invested in their work. They do research. I don't take that away from them. They consult sources. Let's just cut them all the slack you can. They are working hard to come up with these conclusions. What they don't realize is that in the process, we all kind of lose objectivity. We become personally invested in our own conclusions, and we defend them as a matter of pride rather than as a matter of defending the truth. And so you find that people do this with science. And there have been documentaries about this. There have been documentaries about how people have fudged results in order to get them to conform with a narrative that they already held.
Yeah, John Ioannidis, who's he may be the world's most frequently cited scientist. He's had hundreds of publications in refereed journals and whatnot. Ioannidis wrote a fascinating article about 15 years ago why most published scientific results are wrong.
Yep.
And there are a variety of different reasons why that's so that we don't have time to go into. I wondered if I might show another graph here.
Please.
I mentioned earlier how the climate models predict a lot more warming than actually observed. That is the case from, let's see, we'll go here. No, we'll go here, here, and share. That is the case with what are called CMIP-6. Now, the climate models are almost all of them involved in what is called the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. This is a variety of different modeling organizations around the world, all involved in the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Now, these models try to project what global average temperature will be in the future. You can run them so as to go from the past to the future. When you do that with the CMIP-6 models, you get this result. Now, CMIP-6 is 6th generation. The CMIP-5 models, 5th generation, were badly wrong. Here's what we get in CMIP-6. Now, the thick black line here is the actual University of Alabama Huntsville satellite global average temperature measurements data. That's the most accurate thing we have to tell us global average temperature, right? All of these other lines are the various different projections assume that that CO2 in the atmosphere is the primary control over global average temperature.
Okay.
The fact, and then they also all use what is called scenario 8.5 regarding emissions. Now, scenario 8.5 from the UN IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is the worst scenario that they consider, and it is also considered to be the least likely to turn out true. But they all use that. And then we see projections of global warming for this century that run perhaps 4.5 degrees Celsius. That'd be a pretty fair amount of warming, although it wouldn't be historically unprecedented. In reality, if we use more realistic assumptions about emissions through the end of the century, and then if we control for the fact that CO2's warming effect is logarithmic, we would get models that would be closer to the real world observations. But that wouldn't be scary. So
right.
the agenda.
And when you say that, that's really important because empirical evidence at this point seems to confirm that most of us have a negativity bias, maybe the vast majority of people. We dwell on the negative, and probably you could argue that it's a self-preservation thing. We are, you tell us 5 good things are going to happen. The one bad thing is the one we'll focus on, especially if it might be health or safety or life threatening. And they take advantage of this in the way they manipulate data. In the way
that's fed by the media, the news media, which has an old saying:
if it bleeds,
bad news is good news, good news is no news. Because for whatever psychological reason, people get more interested in bad news, and so that means more eyeballs, and that means you can sell more advertising to pay your bills.
If it bleeds, it leads, right? If it bleeds, it leads, right?
So you have an article up here, a simple explanation of why climate models run hot, and that is what you go through, correct?
Yeah, that's by University of Delaware climatology professor David Legates, who's one of our senior fellows. This just went up online last week at Cornwall Alliance. People want to read that, just go to cornwallalliance.org, cornwallalliance.org, click on blog and scroll down and you'll find this one pretty quickly. If I may also mention, we are a private nonprofit organization, 501c3 under the IRS, and we survive by individual donations from private persons. And every month we offer, as a way of saying thanks for a donation of literally any size, doesn't matter how small or large, of course we prefer large, but we offer to send some educational resource. This month, to the end of September, we will send people a set of 10 copies of the educational resource of their choice if they ask for it when they make a donation. Now the list of those is, I'm coming to that here. The list of those is in this blog piece. And so people who want to take advantage of that opportunity just need to go to cornwallalliance.org, click on blog, scroll down to get involved, educate your community, which looks like this, and there's the list. And so there you can find the instructions about how to take advantage of that offer. And meanwhile, it would help the Cornwall Alliance. We definitely need public support.
cornwallalliance.org.
Now, I want to take just a slight turn here for a few moments, and it has to do with this. We are an evangelical organization. mission to cults and non-Christian religions. We definitely believe the Bible is the Word of God, inspired and inerrant,
Right.
and that salvation comes by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. That is all very clear in what we do. And some would say, why are you talking about this? And I would say, because these issues impact the faith, just like many other issues in life. How is this a spiritual connection? How is this connected to anything Scripture teaches, Cal?
Well, a lot of different ways. Let me see if I can come up with a few quick ones. One would be illustrated by a story from the life of Dr. Roy Spencer, who's a climatologist at the University of Alabama. He helps maintain that satellite global temperature record. He's one of the top climate scientists in the world, and he's one of our senior fellows. Years ago, in the 1990s, Roy was wondering, why do climate models consistently over-predict global warming from added CO2 in the atmosphere? And he realized that it's because all of them assume that what are called the feedback mechanisms in the climate system have a net positive effect on any input to the system. In other words, if you add some CO2, which warms the system a little bit, other things will react in such a way as to magnify that warming. And what he realized is that would result in an extremely unstable climate system, and one that would be prone to just run wild into massive warming, starting with just a little bit. And he thought, Genesis 1:31 says, when God had created all that he made, behold, it was very good. That doesn't sound like a climate system that goes catastrophic from a very small input. So he wondered, how can I test some of these things? Well, he has access to the NASA satellites for weather service, and he devised an experiment, because clouds are undoubtedly one of the most important feedback mechanisms in the climate system. And the assumption in the IPCC and all the rest of those has been that when you warm the surface a little bit, clouds will respond in a way that will magnify that warming. He devised an experiment so that he could watch the way clouds actually responded to a little bit of surface warming over time. He ran this experiment for years, and he found through that in fact clouds do the opposite. Warm the surface a little bit, clouds respond so as to minimize that warming. And that is a confirmation of the biblical teaching that, hey, when God created the earth, it was very good. He didn't create it so as to go haywire with the least little change in atmospheric chemistry, right?
So he built in safeguards into he baked it into the way the earth operates.
Good engineer. It's exactly what a good architect does. He doesn't design a building so that if you lean against one wall, all the feedback mechanisms multiply the stress from your weight until the building collapses, right? So that's one way.
That kind of answers a couple of questions. I remember the Exxon oil spill. There's this worldwide panic, and of all people, Rush Limbaugh was going, this is not going to take as long to clean. The ocean is going to do its job, just like it's supposed to do. And to everyone's shock and amazment, the ocean
Same
did
with the BP spill in the Gulf, right? Same with the BP spill in the Gulf. What was the name of the platform? Anyway, that too. Nature cleaned it up really, really well. And in fact, what we did to try to clean it up probably made it worse than it otherwise would have been. So that's one connection to the gospel and the Christian faith. Here's another one. The Bible tells us that we really need to pay a lot of attention to the needs of the world's poor. Now, if economic history tells us anything, it tells us that access to abundant, affordable, reliable energy is indispensable to lifting and keeping any whole society out of poverty. And it also tells us that fossil fuels are the best sources of abundant, affordable, reliable energy that we have in the world, aside from nuclear, by the way. And so therefore, if we care about lifting and keeping whole societies out of poverty, we should be pretty skeptical of notions that we need to stop using fossil fuels, because that will harm the poor. It will slow, stop, or even reverse.
I would say it's funny you should mention this. I'd say it'll increase the number of the poor. There's been this story in the news for a couple of years now that there's talk about appraising the value of houses based on climate change predictions. So that would reduce my house to zero worth. I would never be able to sell it. I mean, well, I'm not sure if it would reduce mine to zero, but houses near me would, and you'd have billions and billions of dollars of real estate net worth. It just vacuumed out of the economy, reducing the owners to paupers. You increase the number of the poor.
Yeah, that is the case. So basically, the whole climate alarmist movement is an anti-poor movement, not anti-poverty, but anti-poor people. And
I recall you and I were talking a few years back about the use of corn, for example, in fuel, and how that has impacted the food availability in poorer countries.
A good friend of mine, Inder Gotlani, who is an economist with the U.S. Department of Interior, has been for many, many years. He wrote an article back in, I believe it was 2012 or 13, maybe 13, in a refereed journal, in which he calculated the impact of America's biofuels policy on world grain prices and therefore on rate of starvation around the world from 2002 to 2012. And he concluded that America's biofuels policy, shifting a whole lot of our farmland from raising food to raising corn for making ethanol to burn in our gas tanks, was causing 192,000 excess premature deaths from starvation and malnutrition around the world every year.
Wow.
Yep.
That is an amazing statistic. So that is not a model that he created. That is through other kind of scientific analysis and comparison that he came up with.
Now it did involve some modeling. You always have to do some modeling, and I'm not anti-modeling. What I'm anti is substituting models for evidence. What he did was he gathered the mortality statistics related to starvation and malnutrition, and he compared how those changed as grain prices changed around the world. And since grains are the biggest proportion of the diet of the poor, because meat and vegetables and fruits are more expensive per pound and per calorie than grains, therefore he was able to show a very tight connection between grain prices and death rates from starvation and malnutrition. Then he also showed that our taking of farmland out of growing grains for food into growing grains for ethanol pushed up the grain prices around the world enough to cause that many extra deaths every year.
So this really is an issue of the faith that we need to be informed about. We can't do everything in an hour, unfortunately, but we've done enough to say, okay, there are serious problems with the claims of those who are suggesting that humans are the cause of climate change, that we are somehow the thermostats controlling the planet. That's simply not true, and that it is a matter of the faith. So they can go to your website. That's important. That's what is the website address again?
Cornwall.
It's in the
CornwallAlliance.org.
CornwallAlliance.org. It's in the description panel. I also have one of your articles listed in there, not the most current one, but I can always add that in. In the meantime, thank you again for being with us. We'll do this again in the future because This is such a good issue. And Ron, can you waltz us out of here?
I think I can. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Do I have the music going on this?
You do.
Oh, good. Wardrobe manager, see how it fits you. Culinary services from Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage is come from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polly Gummis. Our Liberal Denominations Bureau Chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur, special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys. Oh, dehumanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pullen. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham & Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc., in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, though you will never be able to prove that in a court of... Come on, keep that going. I got to remember where not to click my mouse. Okay. Yes, there we go.
Right. So... why don't you all wave goodbye, and we will see everyone next week.
Do the royal